we have it scheduled to go till 5:30. Hopefully we get that far. I imagine we could probably facilitate hours and hours of discussion with these speakers. But you see right there, Jordan Solomon is going to be moderating the majority of this session today. She did the panel last year and she did a really great job, and she was willing to do it again. So thank you, Jordan. But you'll see you can scan the QR code up there as well, and those questions will be coming in live as Jordan also asked some of the other questions. And feel free, if there's any pauses during the discussion, you could also just ask some of your own questions from the audience as well. So with that, I'll give the stage to Jordan. Thank you.
Just all this pressure. Okay. So, but I get really carried away with time. So can someone just give me like a heads up of, okay, thank you. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you everyone for being here. As I think I can speak for everyone, that it was truly a privilege to learn from all of you today. And as we got to listen and be educated by y'all's professional lives and what is most exciting in their research today, we really want to facilitate the opportunity for us to learn more about you personally on a more personal level. So just to start with a clean slate, if everyone could go by their name, their title, who gives you that title, how you identify as a scientist, and then give us a little bit of the backstory of your very first author publication, especially how you celebrated it.
Oh my God.
So to give you guys a minute to think, I can go first to give you guys a minute to think. So I'm Jordan Solomon. I'm a fourth year PhD candidate, which is a little bit different in our EEB program, Ecology Evolutionary Biology program. I identify as a parasite ecologist, and that is kind of because disease ecology is thrown around a lot, but I don't really care about disease. I care about parasites, who they're interacting with, why they're interacting with, and so on. And then my first author publication, small flex, it was during my undergrad. I looked at how ticks are distributed amongst rodent populations. And the punchline was that predator diversity decreases the risk of tick-borne disease transmission in California. So once that got published, how I celebrated it is I first tweeted about it. And then I printed it out and I took some flowers from my field sites during that project and had them pressed. And I printed out the first sheet of that paper and I framed it all together.
No, nice.
So, yeah, I'm kind of cool. Okay, so as an example, if anyone can jump in and.
Who wants to go next?
That was a hard one to beat. I can do this though. So I'm Amelia Martin, but can you prompt me with the specifics you're after? So Amelia Martins, I'm at Arizona State University. I'm a professor in the School of Life Sciences.
How do you identify as a scientist?
I study behavioral evolution, so evolutionary biologist, behavioral biologist.
Cool. And then you're a little bit about your first author publication.
First paper. So my first paper, which was quite some time ago now, was about individual differences in head bob displays. And I remember feeling like, I'm now a world expert in one very tiny little thing. But I did this field study it took a long time. It took me like almost 2 years to go from conception to completion. So I was very happy at the end. But I did not do anything to memorialize the event of celebrating the paper when it came out. I remember receiving those preprints in the mail. It was the old days. So they were paper, they would show up in my mailbox. That was very exciting.
Do you still have the preprint?
No.
I
I do not.
got the reprint.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
it was
they
a
were
reprint. Exactly.
Reprints, yes.
So thank you for that.
All right, so I'm Dan Simberloff. I'm Nancy Gore Hunger Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of Tennessee. I identify as an ecologist. A lot of my work now is in invasion biology. I certainly remember my first authored publication was 55 years ago. And I have no idea if or how I celebrated. I remember the pile of reprints coming in the mail and thinking that's pretty cool. But if I did anything, I have no idea. 55 years old, long time ago. It was very fortunate though, because it was part of my doctoral dissertation and it caught the eye of a lot of people. So parts of that paper and figures from it are still printed in Ecology, which is pretty cool. I hope I celebrated. I don't know
Yeah,
if I
you
did.
probably had a beer.
No, I didn't. I'm not a beer drinker.
Maybe you celebrated when it got accepted. I know some people that do that instead.
I may have, but I don't remember. I remember getting a pile of it.
I'm Kelly Zamudio. I'm at University of Texas at Austin, where I am a fellow, I think I can remember, this is a recent title, a fellow of the Dougherty Endowed Chair in Molecular Biology. And I identify as, I do quite a lot of different things. I mostly identify as a geneticist, genomicist. I do conservation genomics, disease genomics, and organismal diversification studies. So more in those areas. And my first authored paper was a chapter from I'm pretty sure it was a chapter from my PhD thesis, which was on it was the early days of phylogeography. And it was on the phylogeography of short-horned lizards throughout their range in North America. And it was published in Systematic Biology in 1995.
Wow.
And I remember that being like a super huge, I did it in Systematic Biology. And I look back at the paper and it had 175 base pairs of a single mitochondrial gene. Those were the days we sequenced by hand. There was no machine sequencing for us. And the funny thing about that paper is recently I teamed up with Adam Lachey, who's a colleague at University of Washington, who studies horned lizards. I've since obviously moved on to work a lot more on other taxa, including frogs and salamanders. And he and one of his students and I collaborated and we redid my whole chapter in Systematic Biology.
Wow.
And published it recently in a different journal, but it was cool.
That's really fun. Did you ever think that you would go back?
No, and the
questions?
crazy thing is I'm a pretty good record keeper. I've always considered myself a pretty good record keeper. And I went to dig those tissues out of my freezer, which I have been tracking with me since the early 1990s. So it's pretty crazy.
Some
And
might
I
call you
found
a-
them and they're appropriately labeled. And then I could not find the file on my computer, which I thought I kept moving forward. So I had to reconstruct the file from hard copies, which luckily I had printed and put into a 3-ring binder.
Wow. Wow. That's discipline.
Yeah, that's incredible. I'm still losing files like every day.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
So my name is Rodrigo Medellin. I'm a professor of ecology at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the best institution in the world, I have to say. I identify as an ecologist and conservation professional. I mean, when I was conservation professional, it's not conservation biologist. Conservation is much greater than just biology. When I was president of the Society for Conservation Biology, I tried to change the name of the society to Society for Conservation. The biologists are holding.
Yeah.
My first paper was when I was 18, but that's because I started very early. I mean, my first word was not mama or dad or dude, it was flamingo. So my first bat came into my hands when I was 13 years old. So we started looking at the biology of a particular species on the coast of Veracruz. And pretty soon I said, I think we can publish this. And we published it. It was my way out of high school and into the university. And since then, I've never really looked back. How I celebrate it is I keep celebrating right now. I mean, I'm one of the happiest people I know. I cannot believe my life. I'm doing exactly what I want, and they're paying me for it. Don't tell that to the university, but I would do it for free.
That's a really positive outlook on life. I love that. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm Walter Yetz, and I'm at Yale University. I am a professor in ecology and evolutionary biology. That's the name of my department, and the environment. That's my second appointment with the School for the Environment. I identify as a biodiversity scientist. That's what I would usually say, because I really try to bridge a link across ecology, macroecology, community ecology, macroevolution, and biogeography and conservation. Usually using species as units, so at that level of organismal organization, but biodiversity scientist. And then paper. I'm gonna look less good now after you, but I published my first paper also right after high school as part of a civil service, where in Germany you had to do obligatory military service, and you could, however, say that for reasons of conscience, you didn't want to do military service, to use a gun, and then you usually do service in a hospital, but through some early engagement in the bird monitoring community in Bavaria, I got the spot at the Bavarian Institute of Ornithology, where my job was to census birds, and for 18 months instead of shooting with a gun against some targets. And that institute had been around for like 30, 40 years and had been accumulating this data that they've been censusing every day in a disciplined German Beamter sort of state employees way. And it was, so these binders full of data, but there was only one director who analyzed it sometimes. But he felt that I knew more of statistic analysis than he did. So he gave, well, yeah, not, but so it allowed us to look at bird banding records over the course of 30 years and document that the migration of particular bird species between 1960s and the late 1980s had already changed by 6 days in the same way as the origin, the breeding origin of the species had shifted in climate. So
Very cool.
it was just a little paper, but that was the first paper that we put together.
And how do you celebrate your accomplishment?
I don't think I did, because I was together with we also had there was a conservation NGO in the same building, and we were all buddies living together downstairs, and they were also doing the same civil servant thing. And you didn't really talk about these sorts of accomplishments with your buddies of that sort. You would, I think we drank some beers, but I kept kind of quiet about it.
We can celebrate
Because
tonight at the
otherwise
party.
I would get into trouble with them, because that was more about having a good time when you're 19 years old. But
Yeah.
it was overall just a great experience, very rewarding experience.
Yeah, that's super unique. I had never heard of that before. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. That was really insightful. So now I'm going to ask you a pretty big-winded question that has some subsections to it. Whoever gets motivated by one particular aspect of it, feel free to just shout out, okay? Okay, so science has been under attack since about the early 2000s, with climate change taking a lot of the heat. But there has always been some doubts towards science. For example, like the religious beef in evolution, skepticism of vaccination has had a really long history. And more recently, the earth being flat. So, however, in the last few years, the war against science in general has had some major pushback, and it really amplified. So if anyone could please share their thoughts on how to combat the war on science and scientists, how have you seen the public perception of science change ever since you started your career in science, academic or money? And then if you can remember any like particular moment or singular event that you carry with you as like how you are always remembered how to communicate your science because you're nervous about how it might be interpreted by someone.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna
Never be
jump
sorry.
in. This is exactly, this refers to my last slide there with the lessons. And we've all seen this crazy thing. You go out, well, not College Station because this is a school town, but go to Austin or go to any big city and ask the people in the street, what do you think is a scientist is? They're gonna go, oh, they're up in that castle trying to destroy the world. And that's our fault in a big way, because we cannot convey the message of what we actually do because we're always in that ivory tower, talking to our peers and never talking to the public. I'm sorry, but this auditorium should be full of people from College Station. Open to the public, just let them come, let them talk to us, let them listen to these people here. To me, the link is broken, and partly because of us. We really have to find ways to connect. And that goes to the final part of the question, in the sense that I do see, you give me an audience, whatever it is, senators or kindergartners. And many times there's not much of a difference between the two. And that's unfair to the kindergarten, really. But I convince them about the importance of bats or the importance of conservation in half an hour. This is the kind of thing that we all have. We all have the potential to do this, to make this change in whatever society that we're in. And it really works. To finish, so I put the seeds everywhere, and I'm replacing myself in the system. I'm not young anymore. So I am training people on jaguars and bighorn and stuff and things like that. And then sometimes I go incognito. So I went to a cave, one of the caves that my students have been working on. And this is a cave in which young kids used to come and greet you in the parking lot to try to sell you fossil ferns and fossil beautiful things for 5 pesos. This time the kid came to me and he said, give me 5 pesos and I'll tell you why these bats are very important to us. Wow, oh, here's the money. This is the kind of circle closing that we need to promote.
I don't disagree. I think that science communication is everything. I do feel a little bit though that it's the link is broken before we get to university education. Like at least here in this country, and I know in other countries as well in Latin America where I've worked, it's just the K through 12 is just, it's broken at that level, right? So by the time students get to college, 2 things have happened. They're already completely pre-selected. And we know that that selection is biased. It's biased towards people who are affluent, who are not minorities and who are, you know, of a particular kind. So that means that not only are we reaching only a particular fragment of the people who could be scientists, but they happen to not be the ones who are actually experiencing biodiversity conflict, whatever, and who have the least amount of access to science communication, right? So anyway, that's, I think, the way we need to go.
I disagree partly. I have to say, we've been told it's not a new message that we owe it to society as well as to ourselves to communicate our science to the larger world. But, and I'm not saying we shouldn't try, but some of us aren't very good at communicating, period. It's just not our forte. I happen to be one of them. And other people are not great scientists, or they don't try maybe, but they're really good at communicating science. I've dealt with several of them. And I think it's not fair to indict scientists if they don't spend a huge amount of their time trying over the long term. And I agree with you, to be effective, because it does have to, you can't just go to a Kiwanis Club meeting, present your stuff, even if you don't say you're a professor or doctor, and expect it to have much of an impact. But I'm not sure that our best service to humanity is trying to do that if we're not really naturally good at it, instead of working very hard in the ivory tower. And I almost resent, I mean, I've heard this message over and over again since at least the 1970s. It was perceived as a problem that we were somehow not getting our message. I guess it began with the real rise of the conservation movement in the 1960s, maybe. It was quickly identified as partly our fault for not convincing humanity of the things we were seeing. And, you know, we've all tried a lot. And I think you raised the issue when you talked about, you didn't use the word denialism, but this sort of anti-science movement. And it's not even really about understanding science at this point. It's almost like a religious thing. That is, it's about values. And an evidentiary approach, no matter how well founded, is not going to solve that problem. Someone else maybe can, but it's not going to come from scientists, in my opinion.
I don't agree, because if you get kids through science education in high school and they understand the possibilities of learning more in college, that's when the true transformation
Oh,
happens.
I don't disagree with that. I think it has to be before high school. I
Uh-huh.
think it has to be at least in early elementary school. There's sort of a switch that needs to be turned on, and either they recognize a problem with destroying other species or the environment, or they don't recognize it as a problem. And beyond that, it's very hard to change them from one to the other. So I completely agree that there's probably something to be done at a very early age, and it's not being done. But to tell, you know, people who have worked their way through all the work that goes into doing a doctorate, that they're sort of falling down on the job if they don't have a huge amount of time to transmitting what they've learned to the wider public in a form that they can understand and accept. I think it's unfair. Really do.
It's getting interesting. We have a panel with disagreements. I think that's what we were trying to build up. We're able to do it ourselves. So actually, I agree with both of you. I think there is a diversity of just natural talents and abilities and passions. So I think it's totally fair if not all of us are able to do that, right? But I think in terms of a passionate plea for all of us, or any of us, especially the younger folks, to try, right, and give it a try. But then I think if it's not for you, that's totally okay. So I fully agree with you there. Let me add a bit of a different twist to this. So not science communication as a whole, but maybe a bit more on the conservation side. Just one thing that struck me from sort of personal experiences over the last years. So today I was talking about these goals, right, and this language, and which is very sort of bureaucratic and dry, right, and it's certainly clear that with that sort of general aspirational stuff, you tend to not reach people, right, folks on the street. But what I found rewarding actually over the last year is sort of engaging with the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation. There's this thing called Half Earth Day, where we bring sometimes sort of thousands of people together. And I realized that you much better than using the finger, like doing this or talking just about gloom but doom generally. The more you can bring specific species examples and their natural history and the storytelling that Ed Wilson did so great, and many others, right? That some have been able to do. You're captivating people, and anybody from a person who already is passionate about ethically or morally or religiously about biodiversity heritage, all the way over to just hardcore green folks over to your hunter, right? Or your farmer. Because if you're able to talk about a species in a way like you were able to do, right, for those species. So there is just probably no person, as you said, right, that wouldn't care about the jaguar or about even this bat species if after you were able to tell the story. And so I found that really fascinating about science communication, or specifically communication, or specific communication around conservation issues. The more you can bring it and boil it down again to stories of a species, that touches us all, right? Sort of biophilia in a sense. And I found that really powerful. And I think it's something for us to all to take forward. And I found it also interesting in the context of some of the communication and conversations and conservation science sort of moving over to this ecosystem service and function arena, which is also obviously very important. And there's a whole economic argument to be made. But again and again, I feel like if you're able to bring it back to species and the stories there, that's what touches people and brings us forward.
As the only Mexican here, I do agree with everything. I mean, I oversimplify when I describe this as come down from the ivory tower or else. But when you look at the realities of Mexico and the United States, neighbors forever, etc., you see that you might see that there's major differences. Here, it's the political class that is killing science. And in Mexico, it's mostly the budget, the lack of funds for science. The bottom line is, again, that we don't have a philosophy in which science plays a role in everyday life of everyone in the country. And this is what, and I don't think any of us has any idea of how to resolve this, how to open the eyes of people to see that banning books is not going anywhere. Am I saying something bad?
Oh, that's a
No.
positive thing.
Okay, sorry. Didn't know. And that science is in your everyday life. So yeah, the science communicators are crucial in this context. But the people in power are the ones that are gonna have to make a change. And I'm not saying that we all run for office. I'm saying that we need
Maybe
to
we should.
maybe or push the next generation to run for office and change the reality. That may be. So there you go, guys.
What this question reminds me is someone once gave me the advice to humanize myself, come to my community, my immediate family members, my aunt and uncles that are reposting chaotic things on Facebook, and remind them, like, I'm your friendly neighborhood scientist. I'm a scientist. You know me. You know I'm not taking advantage of people. And that has been, once I tried to start doing that, that had been the most challenging, more challenging than outreach to kindergartners, more challenging than to communicate to my students and so on. So I encourage and challenge everyone else to maybe start there, in addition to what everyone else has kind of said. Is like, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just throw in two thoughts. So I was hesitant about this question because I don't have any solutions. And I really, we've heard the same conversation, as you were saying, Dan, some of the same suggestions over and over again. But, there are two things that I've been thinking about personally in the last few years that I don't know where to take, but maybe you guys will have some ideas. And one of them is that we need more training in empathy. So as scientists, we're training students how to speak and how to present and how to do what we just did today, right? But I think there's not very much training in something that's at least as important, which is listening and learning how to absorb what somebody else is saying and put it into your worldview somehow, right? And change who you are because of that. I think that's really important in this context, but also in doing science. When we start doing big science and collaborative stuff, it's really important that we listen to each other in a way that we're not very good at most of the time. And the other thing was about belief, so in this country, at least, the polarization has just been so difficult to deal with. But to me, it's not really science or non-science. It really seems to be an authority-driven thing, it was driven home to me when I was thinking about climate change and how, what do I really know about climate change and how much do I actually know that the climate is changing? When I think about it, there's a handful of graphs that I've seen, maybe I've read a couple of papers, but that's not my field, right? It's not something I do very much, but I believe it, right? I have no doubt in my head that climate change is happening because I believe in science and I believe in the process and I'm very familiar with it. I understand it, right? And when somebody else comes along and says, I don't believe in climate change, if they're not coming from my background, they're believing in something else that may be equally valid to what I'm believing in, right? They're just coming from a different perspective. And if we could understand that perspective a little bit more, open ourselves to it, maybe we could find a way to get through.
Yeah, absolutely.
I am not going to take the credit of so many bat biologists in the world, but jaguars are easy, bighorns are easy. Bats, different story. They had a terrible, terrible negative image, public image. And I started when nobody really worked on bats there, except my mentor, who's the one who called me when I was 13. And then we started growing the group and trying to make a difference. I distinctly remember in the 80s when there was something bad in the news about bats, I was the only one calling the station and saying, no, you're wrong, you got it all wrong, that's so. Today, I'm not the only one, I'm not even the first one to call. Lots of people are doing that. Now, in terms of the less charismatic, let's say, it is a challenge, but I'm sure that everyone, I mean, you feel so passionate about marshes that you have to find an angle. I have a very good friend who's a professor at the University of Arizona on entomology, and she works on a very obscure family of carabid beetles, subfamily of carabid beetles. Well, she decided to put together an insect fair in the summer. And she sets up a stand with live insects there, some other arthropods and scorpions and things like that. And she's always crowded. There's always people there, and many people have come to her to follow their studies with her. I talk about marshes in ecosystem services, for example. If I teach the course of ecosystem services, marshes, and you know what they're good for. It is true. I mean, and in this day and age, in this world of economics, if you don't attach a dollar value to whatever you're doing, you're not going to be successful. And that's why we've been putting together ecosystem services provided by bats with Mexican free-tail bats, millions of dollars, and a third of your rice, a third of your cotton, or a third of your corn, so on. And that kind of thing really grasps the attention of the economics-driven people. So that's my advice, I think.
It's a problem though. And you haven't really answered her question. The Spartina, one could put a dollar value on it. It's not trivial, but the role of salt marshes in many things. But you also said insects that live on them. And, to be honest, many of them could disappear from the face of the earth and it would not affect the salt marsh itself in any way, the Spartina, or anything else. Yeah. It's part of this problem of saying biodiversity as a thing as opposed to individual species. And it's perfectly true that there's some species could disappear and it wouldn't affect anything that in any important way, and certainly not an economic way. And this gets back to the issue that I just pointed to a moment ago. I think there's some sort of switch that's set at a very early age, and in which either you see that there's a problem with driving a species extinct, no matter what it is, or you don't. And if the species is a jaguar, it's maybe easier to attract attention to it and to generate great interest in it. And if it has an economic impact, that helps also. But if it's a plant hopper living on Spartina, you know, I think maybe 90% of people would say in the abstract, we shouldn't be driving species extinct, but you're not going to energize a movement to save Procolegia because it's going extinct, because all it does is eat Spartina. So it's more fundamental even than the economics, and it's more fundamental than the ecology. It's a value that seems to be set very, very early, and it's very hard to convert people that don't have it into people that do. I certainly have no idea how one does that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you speak up?
That microphone might work. Maybe, I don't know.
Is it still, oh, it's just not, is it still on? Oh, hello, hi. So I guess something I wanted to just like throw out there is that something I've kind of noticed as I've been reading more about like traditional ecological knowledge in indigenous communities that focus on that sort of stuff is that there's less of, can you hear me?
We'll translate.
Okay. There's, I guess, more of an emphasis on communities as a whole, like a more of a holistic view of like the environments and how everything interchangeably connects with one another and how they all impact one another. And I think something I've noticed whenever I'm engaging in academics or my classes or research is that we tend to put a lot of emphasis on species rather than their roles with one another or how they interact with other species or the environment as a holistic approach. And so maybe that's a suggestion or like an approach that we can take more is like a focus on the more holistic environment or habitat and like how our habitats aren't even removed from one another. Like they're all interconnected and transitionary in a form.
So the question was traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous ways of knowing biodiversity tend to focus on more holistic images of biodiversity, including all the interconnections within, instead of focusing on individual species. And is that potentially a solution to communicating with the public about the value of saving the bugs that are on Selaginella?
Well, most certainly the general public view of the landscape is something that as scientists we tend to forget. We tend to focus on this species or that interaction between these two species and so on. I am all for bringing on board the indigenous knowledge and bring a whole concept forward, joining together with what we call formal science. I also have to say, I hope I'm not unpopular with this, but you know, what we call in the 70s, 80s, when we were arch enemies in Tallahassee and in Gainesville, the noble savage concept of, oh, well, the indigenous groups really know how to coexist with nature. Look at them, well, yes. The problem is that the indigenous knowledge is now surpassed by the population growth. And that population growth means that their resources cannot sustain them. So they're beyond the knowledge. They are beyond the knowledge. And whatever they know about how to use from spider monkeys to bighorn sheep is overridden by the population growth. Which means that yes, there are some elements that you can extract, but not take it at face value and incorporate it into law.
A lot of it, though, I have to say that I've seen changing is that TEK, which is traditional ecological knowledge, is not always necessarily about the numbers and management. It's about an approach to asking questions about biodiversity. So in that way, it's actually a good thing because it almost goes in some ways to what Amelia was talking about, which is we need to develop an empathy, or we need to develop some way of approaching people's ideas. In this case, their way of approaching these ideas is from a position of acknowledging interaction, right? So I think there's value there, a lot of value there in listening. I mean, there are some incredible books out there on TEK, and just today, this incredible science paper came out. Did you guys see it about the horses and the history of horses? Did you see, was it yesterday? The history of horses relative to Native Americans in the New World. I mean, we had it all wrong, right? That they went extinct and everything. It's like we had it all wrong. They knew exactly what they were doing during that time. Not that they were noble savages, that they were basically part of an interaction with horses that we never really understood. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, no, this is open conversation.
I just wondered, I've heard from like other professionals and kind of noticed in my own work that a lot of the legislative power of conservation comes down to like the Endangered Species Act, the migratory bird trees. So they are very like species focused, pieces of legislation that are, sometimes not all that powerful in conserving habitats and, these kind of larger minded ideas of like communities of species rather than just individuals. So how do you think those laws enable, community conservation and then limit us in terms of community conservation? Or have you noticed,
Well,
Can the
it's-
laws be
that's a
generalized
longstanding problem
to
that,
communities?
we recognize that the laws are species focused, and we're interested in ecosystems and communities. And so that's why we have to deal with things like critical habitat and what exactly is critical habitat, because we're really trying to make the endangered species somehow the marker of a larger entity. And it's a real struggle at times. An obvious example would be the Tongass National Forest, millions of acres, not an endangered species there. And yet we want to preserve large parts of it, and we can't use something like the Endangered Species Act or other species-centered acts. And there have been discussions now for at least since the late 1970s about how can we get some federal legislation at the appropriate level, and it keeps foundering. I've spent a lot of time talking with congressional staff about this for decades, including congressional staff who are associated with senators and representatives who are basically, quite open to the idea, and it just goes nowhere. Because in the end, it's going to step on economic toes, basically. That's my read of the problem. So you've identified a really crucial issue, and it's going to take someone in political science or psychology to solve it, but it's not that it's not widely recognized.
And add sort of on the international front, in the Convention on Biological Diversity conversations and then the goals and targets that came out, was quite a lot of conversation around wilderness areas and large wilderness areas, that those should be recognized. And then in the end, it's in there, in that goal A part, on the top, right there, it was about ecosystem integrity, right, and resilience. Ecosystems are specifically called out. And there was a lot of conversation then around, well, how are you going to measure that, right? So, because then you gotta go into the business of classifying ecosystems, right? And saying, well, we're going to draw the border here. It's this we're going to call an ecosystem. And there's a whole community of scientists now using remote sensing to characterize ecosystems. And that's obviously, you're able to do that really well now with remote sensing in some ways. But then you're missing actually the biological element, right? Something might look like a forest that's intact on the outside, but it might be silent on the inside, right? So, or maybe missing some of the key biological elements. So it's harder yet than working with species, because you need species you can measure. Well, now it's like, this is the species, right? Now it's here and it's not there. An ecosystem, you got to all agree on like one global ecosystem classification, and you better hope that you're not missing out on something, right? So I would be in the camp where we feel like, well, we'll do the best that we can there, but really try and build it up from the species level, so that if we are sufficiently able to bring all relevant species into the picture, in the conservation picture, then we are capturing ecosystems in that way. But that's not imperfect. One final word, there is the target free, the ambitious protected area target. I think that's good news overall. And that actually also plays into the Biden's America the Beautiful, where species, by the way, are not on the forefront at all. They're not even number 4 or number 5. They're somewhere in there. It's about access to nature. It's about equity. It's about, and I think I need to check again, but there is call out about the landscapes and the aesthetic values as well. So hopefully, but that's all not legislation, right? That's just an ambition.
In the US, the National Forest Management Act, sort of has an opening to the kind of thing you're talking about, because of the idea of indicator species. And it's agnostic with respect to what kind of forest, but it is supposed to be an indicator, a well-chosen indicator of some forest community. But in the implementation, it's defeated because they end up managing the indicator species if there's a problem. So it doesn't even work that well, aside from the fact that it doesn't really quite classify the forest. We need something much more, but exactly how to get there, I don't have a suggestion.
I also think that we over rely on things like protected areas, right? We're talking about sparing land, like drawing out the limits and saying do not touch. But there are creative ways that usually involve money, so that's the difficulty, but there are creative ways to get people to do what you want. So for example, here in Texas, if you have more than 10 acres of land, you have the option of getting a tax break if you do one of two things: manage for cattle or manage for wildlife. And managing for wildlife is actually everything that we want, right? Erosion control, restoration of native grasses, planting native pollinator friendly plants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The USDA comes, looks at what you're doing, and you get a tax break, which is not insubstantial. So people will do more for that, I think. And if you could somehow, if we creatively could get people, neighbors, to form associations where the continuity, there was enough agreement and there was enough benefit that everybody was doing it, you could actually create large tracts of land that were moving in the right direction, at least.
So private lands are absolutely key for conservation
Yeah,
success in the US. And just to add, that's really important with regards to target free of the CBD. OECMs, other effective conservation management areas, are called out there. So you could fulfill that 30% target through these sorts of management activities. And absolutely right, that's probably the only way. The time of like drawing out huge national parks is over, right? It's gone. We need to do this differently.
that of course requires owners to have very good decisions in terms of the management of how much cattle you run and so on, but, or how you manage for wildlife, but. I see. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah.
With the last 5 minutes, this has all been really intriguing conversation, so thank you. But with the last 5 minutes, as I've scrolled through some of the submitted questions, which thank you, there's 25 of them. If I'm not obviously going to ask all 25, so please come to Carney's and ask them individually, all of your really cool questions. But as I look through these questions and I look at the room, majority of those in the room are young scientists. Some of these questions here are wondering about career paths and are you happy? Is it worth it? Do I need to pursue a PhD in order to be involved with conservation? So what I would like for all of you to do is look at the audience in their eyes, envision yourself as you were once them, and what advice would you give them?
I don't envy you guys. I mean, if I started over, I would do exactly the same thing, but the hurdles would be this high. Whereas when I started, it was like this. That does not mean by any length that you should be discouraged. Yes, the little piece of paper that says PhD is relevant, is important, and gives you recognition and gives you stature before your peers. But there's a lot of other ways in which people have had a very meaningful impact in conservation practice on the ground with specific communities on its particular habitats, etc. To me, it's going to sound cliche, but it's the passion. What drives you? If what drives you is to do research and then publish it, okay, do research and publish it and not stop there. Go the extra mile and do whatever you need to do to get that paper to become policy, whatever. Or if you want to be a practitioner, there's lots of land everywhere in the world that is due to practitioners working on the ground, working with communities, working in their own land, and establishing from community science, citizen science, to establishing new private areas for conservation or other, what was the term? Yeah, so my 2 cents.
So something that really strikes me whenever I've been asked this question about what kind of advice do you have is that there's nothing special about my advice, right? There's nothing particularly good or relevant or helpful about my advice. And the one piece of advice I would give is to get a lot of advice from a lot of people in your life, and not because the world I went through is different from the world that you're facing, right? And you're going to be in a much better position to know what works in this case or what works in that case. That what we can do is really provide you with some basic tools. And I have a set of tools that I can share with you. And, other people may have different sets of tools, but I think it's in your hands much more than it was when I was going through this stage. It's in your hands to figure out what you need and what's going to make you successful in your own life. I'm happy though.
I used to tell really bright undergraduates who would come to me and wanted to devote their lives to conservation that they could have the biggest impact if they went to law school. And I think for about 30 years, that was pretty good advice. I didn't say they should go. I just said, if that's really the thing they want to do is have the biggest impact on conservation, they could have it by going to law school. But I'm not sure, and I think it was true then. I'm not sure it's true now. But if you're here, that means you're already scientists or committed to being scientists, I guess. And I agree that there are many different ways one can do that as a scientist, but it is unfortunately true that getting a doctorate seems to give one a certain kind of credibility that may not really even be earned. But in order to get hired in state agencies and in NGOs, et cetera, it helps an awful lot, more than it should, but it does. And so that is a piece of advice. I'm not saying you have to do it, but I think it is a fact that should be recognized.
It does give you creds and it increases your marketability. That's just the bottom line. So are you happy?
Of course, I wouldn't do it. I could retire if I weren't happy. Right? I could have years ago.
Because that was part of the question. You want to go?
Well, I'm very happy, and but I want to underscore the passion piece, right? So if you're passionate about, you feel like you're asking yourself a lot of questions, right? You're like excited about questions, about solving questions, solving problems, and this is you're passionate about your system or your species or whatever it is. This is the best job in the world potentially, and that PhD time can be some of the most amazing time, both intellectually as well as socially, right? And it's important that socially as well, or in terms of quality of life and the right balance. But if you're not passionate, like, so just to tick the box, right? I need, then it might be one of the harder things to do, right? And I guess the good news is that one thing I want to say is that while academia can be tough, if you have the right passion, you can, and dedication, you can make it work. And other good news is that there's actually, I feel there's a growing need and a growing diversity of a needs for PhD educated young scientists. And I feel in the conservation arena, and there are many other arenas, it's just one, I certainly see, I see this becoming more, maybe I'm optimist, but it could be helpful to bring some other skills along with you, part of it, but outside maybe your core PhD thing, do other things, right? That could then be marketable in other ways. But there is, I think, there's demand, and that's not going away. So that's, I guess, it's a good news.
I agree. There's more diversity and opportunities for employment now, for sure, with the skills that we have. Yeah. So I don't have any particular advice, but I am very happy, and I'll tell you guys why I'm happy. I'm happy because I always knew that I didn't want to have a boss, and I don't have a boss. Like, I mean, nominally, I answer to my chair and to my dean, but I know exactly what I need to do to continue being employed. I know exactly which parts of it I like to do and which parts I don't, and I can manage those. And I know exactly how to learn how to do things better if I'm not doing well at them. So if I do my teaching, if I do my research, if I get my grants, if I write my papers, all of which, by the way, I enjoy, I have a job. I mean, that's incredible.
Enjoy writing grants?
I actually do, believe it or not.
I hope the things you that the best part of our job.
It's incredible because it forces you to put your ideas down. I don't like the writing the, all the detailed stuff and sending it to
Okay.
fast lane, but I do like the ideas. The best thing of my job, and this matters for those of you who actually think that you might enjoy mentoring people, is I think the best part of my job is watching my students succeed through all the difficulties, through all the stress, and then go become professors and have students of their own. And that is just amazing. Like, if you like that kind of continuity, that's just totally great for me. So
With a twist, but I agree completely with what Kelly said. The twist is that my first conversation with the student that is sitting in my office is, and it's hard, and I don't demand an immediate response, but I say, tell me where you want to be in 5 years, And my job is to get you where you want to be. I don't want to make clones of you, of me out of you. If you want to be a government official, if you want to be an NGO, whatever, my job is to help you get there. If that means publishing papers, fine, let's publish the papers. If that means meet with officials, let's go meet with officials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is your passion. This is what moves you. What is it that you want to do?
Well, awesome.
Applause for our pioneers. All right, so that goes ahead and concludes EIS for day one. I hope to see all you guys tomorrow morning for another good run of student talks and tonight at Kearney's. Yep, make sure you're there.